So, in earlier modules we have discussed the one of the training and methods of the training, that is about the business game. Now, I will discuss the another method, and that is the role play. Role play is very popular in the especially situations where the person has to increase his efficiency and effectiveness. Now, here in the role play we ask the people to have a different type of the roles they are have to play in the business context. So, what is the role play? Role play have trainees act out characters assigned to them, that is there are different characters are there. In many textbooks also you will find at the end of these chapters in the business management books, they especially in HRM, OB, you will find at the end there are the different role plays have been given. And there are different characters the trainees they have to act those characters. So, also it becomes very much interactive. Information regarding the situation is given to them, that is if this is the situation, like I always give one situation and that is a real time situation. When I was a labor officer in the Hukumchand mill, I was I was asked from the management, that is if there were 3 sheds and the one shed, that the shed C that was supposed to be closed, and then how will you do? So, then the positive incentives, positive motivation, and those schemes are to be introduced, and therefore, in that case if this is the situation, how will you do that? Role plays are also important in change management, that is if this is a situation and you have to do the change, how will you do the change? However, here in the example in my next module you will see, that is the role play example I have taken for the leadership styles. So, work or interpersonal problems are there. So, at the workplace, if for example there is a low productivity, then you are a production manager, how will you increase the productivity? There is a problem in the market demand, and you are a marketing executive, how will you study, analyze and report, and actions will be taken as a marketing executive. So, these type of these situations are provided to the trainees, and the trainees have to see that is how they will handle that situation, and that situation has to be discussed, that is the whether the trainee, whatever situation the solution for the situation is provided, what are the pros and what are the cons are there, that we have to see, and on the basis of this that will be decided, that is the whether the solution given by the trainee is correct or not. Role plays differ from the simulations. Now, we have to understand carefully the difference between the role play and the simulation. So, simulations on the basis of the response choices available to the trainees. Now, here so therefore, already the choices are given and the trainee has to opt for those choices, and while in case of the role play he is having the full freedom. Trainee has to make the solutions according to his choice, while in the case of the simulations, then that situation is given and what choices were available in that situation, that is also informed. So, therefore, we have to be very clear to differentiate between the what is the role play and what is the simulation, and the level of details of the situation given to the trainees. So, there not only the what is the responsive choices are there, but then the what are the situation details of the situation, that is also has to be made clear. Role plays may provide limited information regarding the situation. So, therefore, in that case it is very important, that is the role play is not giving you like a simulations the full details. So, it is a limited information. Now, you have to assume, you have to think, you have to find out, that is okay, if this is a situation assuming that yes, for a simple example, for the closing one department and starting another department in the organization, or the shifting of the workers from the one department to the another department, that you have to assume. There can be two assumptions. One is union is present, other is union is not present. If union is present, what will be the reaction? Union is not present, what will be the reaction? So, therefore, in that case it is to be seen that is the role plays that may provide limited information regarding the situation, whereas the information provided for simulation is usually quite detailed, while in the simulation it is the totally the situation is replicated, and therefore, in the simulation everything is informed. It is not limited information like role play. Here is the full detail is there in case of the role play. In case of the role play, the detailed information is not there, while in case of the simulation the full information is provided. There is another difference in the role play and simulation. A simulation focuses on physical responses, that is the pull a lever, move a dial. So, therefore, in that case a simulation is totally focusing on the physical responses, while role plays focuses on interpersonal responses. That is example, ask for the more information, resolve conflict, and if the conflict is there, then how to resolve the conflict, then that is to be taken care of. So, these conflict resolution techniques. Now, in the conflict resolution techniques, then we can go for the different strategies. For example, when we talk about the conflict strategies, then that can be like this, whether you are going to making the whenever there is a low concern and the high, then sometimes you have to avoid the conflict. So, avoidance strategy that will work, or low and high and low and high. So, therefore, in that case you have to see, that is you are able to go for these particular situations, and then in that case it will be whenever we are talking about this high concern, low concern and the low and high concern of the self and low and high concern of the others. So, sometimes if the concern for the self and concern for the others, if it is low, then avoid, but if the concern for the self is high and the concern for others is low, and then you have to accommodate. Similarly, if it is like the others concern is high, your concern is low, self concern is low, then we are talking about the competitive, or there can be the collaboration, or there can be the compromise. So, these 5 strategies. So, role plays can be there, and then you have to see if this type of the conflict is arising, then the how we can go for this particular type of the strategies, and then decide the strategies to resolve the conflict. So, what trainer will do? Trainer will give a situation, that is a conflict has arisen. A conflict may be arise between the superior or subordinate, or conflict may arise between the colleagues, conflict may arise between the two departments, and then what strategies are, how will you adopt those strategies, how will you resolve those strategies, and that will be discussed. In a simulation, what will happen? The outcome of the trainee's response depends on a fairly well defined model of reality. So, in the simulation there is no assumption, there is no scope, there is no window to think of, and therefore, in that case it is totally based on the reality, and if this is the reality, then definitely the one has to think of, that is the what can be the situation, and if the reality is the situation, then one has to think of, that is the how this particular reality that will work. If a trainee in a flight simulator increases the angle of the flaps, that action influences the direction of the aircraft. So, therefore, that these video games, that is becoming a really a very good example, and then nowadays that is have a feeling of flying a plane, and then in that case as soon as in the simulator because it is as a similar situation as it is there, it is close to reality almost. So, therefore, if you will simulator increases the decreases the angle of the flaps, immediately the action influences the direction of the aircraft. If this happens, then how will you handle that particular situation? So, in a role play, outcomes depend on the emotional and subjective reactions of the other trainees. So, this is very interesting, that is, it is the emotional, it is a emotional response is there, and if the emotional response is there, then we have to think of, that is, what will be the solution. In our further modules, I will be discussing about the group discussion, brainstorming sessions, panel discussions, and therefore, in that case we have to take care, that is, how the situations that we will be able to handle emotionally. Like the leadership, if the leadership is there, and then emotional balance is required, and emotional quotients, emotional intelligence. So, therefore, we have to consider, that is the how in a given situation, if you are playing a role play is there, the trainer that you ask the trainee to demonstrate, and during the demonstration of the role play, the actor who is playing this particular character, then he has to keep in his mind that emotional stability. If he is not emotional stable, then definitely in that case it will be very difficult for that particular character to take a right decision. So, trainer can correct, trainer can point out, that is, this was the situation, and in this situation you have emotionally reacted. But when you are leading an organization, then definitely you are supposed to be emotionally stable. So, if you want to take a right decision, then your EQ has to be properly balanced, and EQ is to be demonstrated, emotional quotient is to be demonstrated, and then only you can play the role very effectively. So, how to use the role play for giving the training effectively? Trainers need to engage in several activities before, during, and after the role play. That preparation is required. What preparation is required before the role play? Before the role play, first it is critical to explain the purpose of the activity to the trainees, right. So, therefore, if you explain the purpose, then during role play we may create the boundaries, limitations for that particular role play, and if we create that boundaries, then definitely there will be a problem. So, what is required? That is the this increases the chances that they will find the activity meaningful and be motivated to learn. So, therefore, if we are making them the clear about the situation, then definitely the purpose of role play, they will find it meaningful. That is, we are giving the situation, you have to play a role play, and then that will help you to understand in a given situation what you will do, and then it is easy to correct step or not, that we will discuss, and therefore, that will give the purposeful exercise, that is the meaningful will be there. And once they will learn, that is by doing this exercise, that is the role play exercise, they will be able to demonstrate their thought process, their emotional intelligence, their team building efforts, their decision making styles, their conflict management, their stress management, their affection to the organization, their implementation of the organization culture. So, all these aspects they will be discussing into that particular role play, because the role play cannot be the out of the organization culture. If somebody goes out of the organization culture, then definitely he will be unfit, and if he is unfit, so his stay in the organization maybe for the shorter time as compared to the when he shows that he is integrated properly with the organization culture. Second, the trainer needs to clearly explain the role play. That is what is the role play is there, and what is the characters roles are there, and the time allotted for the activity. So, that has to be very specific. like here you will find that is there is a specific time is allotted, and in this time allotted my 3 students PhD scholars, they will demonstrate that is what is the activity they are supposed to do. A short video may also be valuable for the quickly showing trainees how the role play works, and therefore in that case we can show this particular video. Earlier the role plays have been done, and then by understanding those videos the one can demonstrate the role play more effectively. Now this was the before the activity, before the role play, that is the what they are supposed to do. Now during the activity how they will act that particular character, and what trainer has to guide them. Trainer needs to monitor the time. So therefore whatever time is given during under that time period only, these trainees, they are required to demonstrate the skill. Degree of intensity, if somebody is playing the role of a worker, then the degree of intensity has to be there like a worker. If the degree of intensity is to be a manager, then there is has to be high degree of intensity in that role of a manager, which is to be demonstrated, and focus of the group's attention. So therefore rest of the members, those who are associated with this particular character and their association, that is also required properly to be demonstrated. And is the group playing the roles or discussing other things unrelated to the exercise? This is very important. That is the whenever you are giving a character to a person, and then how that person is doing that particular character, that is to be taken care of. If the playing of that character, right, and they discussing the other things which may not be related to that character, then the trainer should enter, and then the control. However, when we are talking about this particular role, and where the trainer is need not to be there, trainer can be the spectator, and then he can give his comments, that is whether the role is properly played or it is not played, and therefore that exercise of the participants has to be done. The less trouble the trainer should have with a focus and intensity, and therefore in that case the more and more the possible support is required, and the possible guidance is required by the trainer, so that the trainees, when they are playing the role, right, let them play the role first. We should not interfere in playing the role, but yes, the trainer can make the notes that what the role player has done, and then can give the feedback or comment on that particular role. However, one thing is to be very clear, let the trainee suggest his solutions. Let the trainee may think of the any other solution which trainer has thought of, because it is not, but not necessary that is the one solution will be the best solution. There can be the other solutions also, and then we have to discuss the pros and cons of the solutions. Trainer should not emphasize only on one solution, rather than he has to try to understand why trainee has given this solution, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of that solution, and in what context and the background of the study which was given to trainee he has come out this particular type of the solution. Then definitely in that case he will be able to consider that is the whether his solutions were the proper or not proper, the role play is properly done or not done. Actually in the role play already in the script there is written that is the what solution will be provided, right, but with the limited information, and therefore in that case the actor who is playing that character, that he can make the assumptions of certain situations, and therefore the more meaningful the exercise will be there during the activity to be if the participants are allowed the freedom, and the less trouble the trainer should have with the focus and intensity, then definitely then during the activity he can demonstrate that particular type of the solution. Now whenever we are talking about the after the role play, that is what is after the role play, at the conclusion of the role play debriefing is critical. This is very important. Like in the case of the business game, the debriefing is done, and then they have to show a particular the expectations or the situations, that is the how exactly the business game is going to play. But when we are talking about the role play, the trainer he is supposed to demonstrate the debriefing, and then the debriefing, then it will be very critical, because debriefing helps trainees understand the experience. He has gone through that particular role play, and now he is eagerly looking towards the trainer that what is the feedback, and if that feedback is positive, then definitely in that case the debriefing will be helping the trainees to understand the experience and discuss their insights with each other. Now naturally the role play is involving more than one person, and therefore in that case when they discuss with each other, so it will give more insight. So they should be allowed to interact, they should be allowed to create certain dialogues, right. So therefore in a given situation, so they can make the more realistic approach to the role play, and when we are making the more realistic approach, then definitely there will be the different solutions, and then the solutions will be evaluated by themselves. Trainees themselves will evaluate this type of the situations. The trainees should also be able to discuss their feelings, what happened in the exercise, that is how they have felt from by their own emotions level, what they have learned from this particular exercise, and how they experience their actions. They are becoming very result oriented, and if they have learned and their experience in their actions, they are talking about, that is the yes, they have got the insight. And if there is an experience, then definitely there should be the insight, and if the insight is there, their actions will be decided, that is the yes, what the actions they have taken, that is having a strong support, and resulting outcomes will be related to the incidents in the workplace. So therefore in this particular role play, trainee will be able to discuss their feelings, their emotions, what happened in their exercise, what they have learned, how the experience is there, what are their actions and resulting outcomes are there related to the incidents in the workplace, and accordingly it will be decided. So this is the about the before the role play, during the role play, and after the role play. Now we will talk about the uses of role play. To demonstrate clearly a feature of some specific behavior in a lively and the direct way, such as interviewing. So sometimes in the role play we are having the interviewing also, that is the one person is interviewing to the another person, and with the chairing a meeting, like that is the HR is like in this role play which we are going to demonstrate, there will be the HR head, and HR head will be interacting with the two line managers, and when they are with these operations manufacturing production managers, then in that case that how this meeting is held, and then what decisions have been taken, and do they find that these decisions they have been supportive or not, or greeting the customers. So there may be a role play, that is how do you greet the customers, and then how the customer is delighted, because nowadays we are not talking about only the customer relationship management, but we are talking about the how you are delighting the customer, the delighted customer is delighted. So this greeting the customer, this will be the uses of that particular role play. To increase the involvement of the group, so trainees are there, number of trainees are there, and those all trainees they can be asked, that is the how they can be involved in this particular group, and if they are involved in the group activity, this type of the role play, then definitely their involvement in the training, that will be more, they will be more participative. To help people understand a situation from the viewpoint of others. Now because it is the interaction between two persons or more than two persons, so therefore it will be helping them to understand the viewpoint of others, what are the viewpoints, what others says, and then how the same problem is seen by the other person, and how the X is looking at that particular situation. So therefore this type of the situation from the viewpoint, then that will be helping them. To give insight into important behavior of someone and its effect on others. So naturally when the role is played and somebody is watching, or the rest of the trainees are there, they are watching that role play, directly or indirectly they are getting the message. That is, if this is the situation, what should be the decision making process? If this is the character, how to handle this particular character? If the character is facing this problem, how to solve this particular problem? So, therefore, it is giving the insight, the important behavior of the someone and viewpoint of the others. So, it is always a better interpersonal relationship or dynamics, and that interpersonal dynamics that will show, that is the how we are giving that important behavior, so that with the role play we are also monitoring the character's behavior. To make possible experiment in a no risk free setting, and if there is no risk and free setting is there, then definitely they can make it the very useful this role play. Participants can try tactics new to them. So, whatever has been told, then definitely in addition to that, the participants can also try the tactics what is new to them, and employ alternative behaviors to evaluate their effectiveness, and therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the what are the alternative behaviors are there to evaluate their effectiveness at the workplace. Now, when to use the role play? In a role play, the participants engaged in actual behavior, confronting problems and interacting with other individuals, so associated with them, and therefore, in that case these role plays are to be played. As participants move on in the activity, they receive immediate feedback from the others, and this helps them to fine tune their behavior. And then as soon as they may fine tune their behavior on the basis of this role play and understanding of each other, many people they learn, and then they believe that is at the workplace they will start behaving either in the positive role play, or they will not behave in the negative role play, and that behavior will start, and they will get the immediate feedback from the role play itself, that is the how they are working at their workplace. And this helps them to fine tune their behavior to bring it closer to actual conditions in the area of work. At the actual workplace, this role play demonstration will make more efficient and more effective at their workplace. Participants also get insights into the issues and the situations that form part of the role play, and therefore, through interaction with others and observations, thus the role play helps in establishing a link between the training and realities of the practical work. So, therefore, when they get these insights and issues say of the situation, and that form part of the role play through interaction with others and observation, so therefore, they learn. So, learning becomes faster, and then as a result of which they understand also that is their behavior is proper or not, and thus role play help that in establishing a link. A link is there between the training and their actual workplace, and whenever this type of the link is developed between the training and the workplace, then definitely that will giving them the realities of the practical work. So, therefore, role play should be used to increase transfer of training to participants' job conditions, and if you increase the transfer of training to the participant job conditions, it becomes more and more popular and effective method and interactive method, and they will be able to connect the classroom training with the real workplace, and their efficiency and effectiveness that will be increasing. Now, there are the different types of the role play. Simple role play, this is the simplest form of the role play. The small group 2 to 3 persons, as we are going to demonstrate, performs before the larger group or an audience, acts as the observer, and at the end of the presentation analyzes and evaluates it. In a simple role play, the feedback is readily available to the role players, and they will be able to develop the insight into the behavior of the roles that they have been playing, and these evaluative comments are more effective as they come from different sources, and it becomes more and more effective and relevant, because it is not from the one source, they are from the different source. There are the multiple role plays are there. When the purpose of the role playing is to involve the whole or a large part of the group, multiple role playing is to be adopted. and then in that case in this exercise the group is divided into the convenient role playing groups, and the various subgroups play the role simultaneously, working on the same situation and with the similar issues. So, if the group is large, then definitely we can make the use of the multiple role play and ask the different groups. The groups are divided into the subgroups, and then accordingly they will be helping each other, and then the overall message can be delivered. Generally this type of role play is structured and the stage after proper preparations that may include written scripts and instructions are there, because you are involving the lot of characters. So, therefore, to avoid the any mismanagement, it is better that it is already given to them in writing, ask them to prepare, and then the instructions can be given. There can be the reverse role play also. Reverse role play is used when two participants have reached what appears to be an intractable situation in their discussions, and the participants may be asked to switch roles. The move may help to understand and respect the other person's point of view, and therefore, once they have played the role of a boss, now they have to play the role of a subordinate, and then they will understand the emotions of the each other. There can be the spontaneous role play. Spontaneous role play like we are having normally in this after in the training, normally the spontaneous role plays are there, that they have given in this variation. No script is made available and the participants are asked to play the roles before the group. A situation will be given, there is no preparation and participants are instructed to play the roles as directed by the trainer, and therefore, in that case this type of the spontaneous situation may arise. So, these are the different types of the role plays, and there are the uses and how to conduct the make the preparation by a trainer before the role play, during the role play, and after the role play, and how it is different from this simulator that we have discussed in this particular session. And now I will demonstrate with my PhD scholars, that is the exactly how role play is to be demonstrated during the training program. Thank you.